Right now, folks, it's time for your reality check. Are you ready for the reality check? Well, here it is. America, let's be real. Poverty is a disease. It's curable, but it's still a disease. And the disease of poverty is so bad that it actually has other diseases attached to it. These conditions disproportionately affect the world's poorest, either in the developing world or in developed countries with extreme inequalities like here in the United States. And while well-known conditions like HIV, AIDS, and malaria are considered diseases of poverty, many other illnesses are primarily strike the world's poorest and are lesser known and are frequently misunderstood. We're going to explore why these diseases are ignored and what we can do about them. And I mean, I gotta tell you, the reason why we're covering this story on the show is because when you think about poverty and you think about some of these diseases, you think about third world countries, right? You think about Central Republic of Africa. You don't think about the United States. So I'm going to talk about some of the diseases that you have in poor developing countries like Sri Lanka, Nepal, and the Central Republic of Africa. And I'm also going to tell you about diseases that you've heard of that are well known that are happening right here in America, that are well known, but I like to call them diseases of poverty because it's exactly what they are. Now, the World Health Organization has designated about 20 conditions as neglected tropical diseases. This diverse array of conditions such as leprosy and elephantiasis don't attract the global media attention for funding that certain wide-ranging tropical diseases such as malaria have garnered in recent years. Neglected diseases cost developing economies billions and billions and billions of dollars annually, and lock suffering people into cycles of poverty that are nearly impossible to escape. So why does the rest of the world overlook or ignore these diseases? Here's what one of the world's leading experts on economic development and fighting against poverty from Columbia University, his name is Jeffrey Sachs, and here's how he talks about linking poverty and disease.
Poverty and ill health go together, and we need to understand that linkage of poverty and ill health, because understanding it enables us not only to address the challenges of heavy disease burdens in poor countries, but also gives us an added and very important tool for breaking the poverty trap itself.
So why does the rest of the world overlook and ignore some of the diseases? Number one, many of them aren't deadly. Many of the diseases that the diseases of poverty aren't fatal. Because they're not big killers, these diseases don't attract a lot of funding, they're not getting you Nobel Peace Prizes, and thus nobody pays them any real attention. The other reason why people don't pay them attention is because they're so common that nobody thinks they're diseases that are connected to poverty. I'll give you an example. Type 2 diabetes. Now, type 2 diabetes is usually connected with obesity. Now, obesity has a correlation and a causation to poverty because in many places where poor people live in the developed world, there are what we call food deserts. And a lot of times where there are food deserts, there are also medical deserts. There's no place to get adequate health care. There's no access to adequate health care. And there also isn't access to actually being able to get healthy foods. So thus, people eat really bad foods that are high in high fructose corn syrup, high in sugars, high in trans fats, and thus they become obese. And when they become obese, they develop a perfectly curable disease called type 2 diabetes, which ultimately leads to their death. Sometimes not right away, but their death eventually. But because it's not the biggest killer in the world, nobody's trying to solve it. The second reason, they affect the most marginalized community. The neglected tropical diseases can be found in 149 countries across the world, predominantly sickening, extremely poor who live in developing or remote areas. Those affected might live far away from health services. In the absence of health education and outreach programs, sufferers can live for years without proper diagnosis and treatment. And that's like elephantiasis, that's leprosy, and that's happening in parts of Africa. That's the continent of Africa, because Africa is not a country. We should tell our president that. But beyond that, it's also happening in parts of Asia. It's happening in parts of Central and South America, on and on and on. But the other thing I want to add to that is when you talk about the most marginalized communities, let's talk about right here in America. So this winter, okay, this story is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Two individuals, two senior citizens in the past 3 weeks in the city of downtown Atlanta, two senior citizens died from hypothermia. Hypothermia is a curable disease. All it means is you've been exposed to the cold for far too long. That's it. That's all it means. So if somebody had brought these people in from the cold, or if somebody had checked on them and made sure that they had adequate heating, they would still be alive today. But in the past 3 weeks, Atlanta police, this is the United States of America, Atlanta, one of the major cities in the world, they've responded to 2 deaths that were caused by hypothermia. In each case, the bodies were found wrapped in blankets in downtown Atlanta. Police said the man and woman, found weeks apart within miles of each other, were both homeless. So they were poor, they were homeless, and nobody cared about them, i.e. they were from a marginalized community, and they died primarily because of the disease of poverty. And one of the connected diseases to poverty in the United States of America during the winter time is hypothermia. Number 3, treatment exists, but it needs to be improved. Advocates say better drugs are solely needed for neglected tropical diseases. But with little global focus on these illnesses, there is often a lack of funding to improve the efficiency of the treatment. Now that makes total sense to me because pharmaceutical companies care about one thing: profit. We talked about this on last week's show about the company of Pfizer, who ended their research on Alzheimer's and Parkinson's because they would rather use that money to pay their CEO a lot more money and to do stock buybacks as well as pay out stock dividends instead of researching Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Now this goes beyond that. I guarantee you this, Pfizer in no time in the near future will be looking for a cure for leprosy because that's not going to make them a lot of money. Because diseases of poverty don't make you money because the people who benefit from them are poor and cannot afford to pay for the drug. Right? And remember a couple years ago when we had that, I forgot his name, but he was the douchebag who ran a pharmaceutical company who ran the prices up of drugs that everybody needed? Yeah, that's what pharmaceutical companies do. So then it comes down to government. And America, our NIH, the National Institute of Health, used to do a lot of research on a lot of these neglected diseases. But then Republicans said, oh, this is fraud, waste, and abuse by our government. We need to stop doing this. And everybody, smart people, were like, wait a minute. Isn't it the job of government to help people pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? The key words I want to put out here is life and the pursuit of happiness. And so when you do this research, you help people have a better life. And when they have a better life, they can pursue happiness better. Right. Well, when Republicans cut the NIH and they cut the Center for Disease Control and they stopped them from doing research, then they cannot find cures or more efficient ways or drugs to deal with these neglected diseases. And number 4, sufferers face intense social isolation and stigma. Many of the people who are disfigured or disabled as a result of neglected diseases live in communities that may not acknowledge or understand the disease. Hypothermia, like I just talked about, is a great example of that. Now, here's the question I have for you at home. Some of you who watch this show live in Atlanta. Would you know what hypothermia looked like if you saw it on the street? You probably wouldn't. And to be frank with you, neither would I. But these are all diseases of poverty that are curable if we took the opportunity to actually try to solve poverty, which is absolutely curable.